my first mobile app was a barcode scanner. This was embedded electronics. It was an inventory system for a Cisco subsidiary. They were stocking vending machines and things like that, counting candy bars in their warehouse. And I still remember that was also one of my biggest mistakes, because you mentioned malloc errors. This thing had a global heap, no local variables, nothing was local. I misunderstood or underestimated how much RAM this thing had. It was 4 kilobytes, by the way.
But like older than that, whereas the tan and black screen.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I don't know the name of that, but the tan and black screen
old school LCDs, right?
Exactly. And so what we had done is we developed a proxy. We called it the translation proxy. All right, today with me, I have Chad Robinson, the man, the myth, the legend, a friend of mine for a very long time. You and I got introduced through Jason Cole, who gets a shout out.
Yeah, years ago.
As well, long time ago. And the thing I like the most about Chad is he's funny, and he's also very fun to talk to. So Chad and I actually have a lot of shared experience around mobile application development. It's one of his sweet spots these days, and he can do all kinds of things. But I feel like on this episode, I want to dig into this idea of how mobile application development has changed over the years. And you're going to get some like old men screaming at cloud sort of vibes, uphill in the snow both ways type of approaches. But yeah, let's jump right in. First, Chad, why don't you give us just a brief history of your experience in general?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot to unpack. So when we're looking at what's changed in web and mobile, I mean, it's not just over the past years, it's over the past few months, right? I mean, This is something where if you're not running, you're not going to keep up with it. And I think probably every quarter, either Apple or Google or somebody is doing something that puts us all scrambling, and we have to jump through hoops to comply with new requirements and reviews and things like that. So it's I think it's one of the most interesting, but also one of the most challenging spaces I've been in. And my background spans backend and mobile and web and kind of all sorts of different domains. But web and mobile, I really feel like the pace of change is so high that you're just running to keep up all the time.
Yeah, and thank React for that in some ways. Facebook likes to break things all the time.
Move fast and break things.
Right, which is cool. I like that. But it is a hidden cost in mobile applications that a lot of teams don't actually take into account, especially if someone outsources a mobile build to us, where we do it, we execute on it, we hand it back. One of the first things we say is, oh, by the way, you're going to have to feed and care for this thing. It's kind of like your pet now. It's like, you have to feed it, water it, care for it, and keep it up to date. But let's go way back. Let's talk about the beginnings, right? So
How way back?
Well, let me say where I'm entering, and then you can come. You have an even farther back history. Let's not get in the way back machine too much. But so I began my career working at Danger, which nobody knows what that is. It's the company that was responsible for the T-Mobile Sidekick. A lot of people thought that T-Mobile built this thing. That's actually not the case. They worked some interesting deals back in the day to get an exclusive licensing of the platform through T-Mobile's various, both their international carriers and the carriers here in the U.S., which, by the way, T-Mobile's a German company. I don't know if anybody knew that. But I started building one of the first Java virtual machines to run on top of an ARM9. And before that, my first phone was a flip phone that got malloc errors, which was kind of fun. So that was all C and C++. And this was before you could do anything on the platform. So I remember actually getting our first dev revisions of these sidekicks. I think at the time we were working on the Zante, which is the sidekick slide. And I wasn't cool enough to work on firmware, but my friend Larry Harris sat next to me, and he would hook up the JTAG on the dev boards, and he would be flashing like TI modem code, and we would be working together. I was very fascinated to always sit next to him and ask him a lot of annoying questions about how all of this works. And it was just, that to me was the very beginnings of mobile development, because this is pre-iPhone. What was your experience early on?
Oh, well, I had two interesting beginnings to mobile, and they're completely unrelated, one development, one not, because my first cell phone came in a briefcase and had to be professionally installed in my car, was mounted on a stalk, It had
Yeah.
a data connection, but it was 300 baud, and we thought that was great
Ooh.
because it was just enough to get in and mess around on an X25 connection to fix a
Mm-hmm.
bank's, connectivity. So that was not an area we were developing apps for. My first mobile
Mm-hmm.
app was a barcode scanner. This was embedded electronics. It was an inventory system for a Cisco subsidiary, not Cisco themselves, but they were stocking vending machines and things like that, counting candy bars in their
Mm-hmm.
warehouse. And I
Yeah.
still remember that was also one of my biggest mistakes because you mentioned malloc errors. This thing had a global heap, no local variables, nothing was local. And so I misunderstood or underestimated how much RAM this thing had. It was 4 kilobytes, by the way, and let that
Nice.
overflow and made my own first buffer overflow error in my own code. And this was back in 96, I think, maybe 95. So
Mm-hmm.
we're going pretty far back in the day, but that was mobile at the time,
Yeah.
pre
So
cell phone.
I was after you for sure. But the thing that I thought Danger was doing that was interesting, and I'm curious if there's anyone you ran across in your travels that was doing this, because I like to think of Danger was probably one of the first companies to solve a problem that we solve today through things called responsive web, right?
Hmm.
So each sidekick, we got these things from Sharp,
Hmm.
and the screens would get progressively bigger. I think the
Right.
the version I worked on, which was the Sidekick 3, I think we had just gotten to a 400 by 300 pixel screen.
Hmm.
But we also had these older devices, some of them with even like not even I forget the technology at the time. Maybe it's like OLED, but like older than
Hmm.
that, where it's the tan and black screen.
Oh, right.
I
Yeah.
don't know the name of that, but the tan and black screen
Just
that would
old school LCDs, right?
exactly. And so what we had done is we developed a proxy. We called it the translation proxy, and it
Hmm.
was a set of web servers, and every Sidekick would have a 3G connection up into the cloud, and then we actually ran all those connections through a proxy server that when you did a request for a website, because apart from BlackBerry, I think we were kind of one of the few devices that had a full-featured web browser. I mean, everybody had a web browser, but this was a full-featured web browser. And we would actually transcode. So when you go out and look for a particular website, we would pull that down to our transcoder proxy service, and that transcoder proxy was written in Perl, by the way, would
Hmm.
take that, and it would actually do translations of the website into something you could see on a 400 by 300 screen. So this is the
Right.
first iteration, at least to my knowledge, and I'd love to hear your historical view of this, but the first iteration that I know of this concept of responsive, which is one of the hard problems you have to solve in mobile because of all the different pixel sizes, except for maybe these days, but we'll get into that in a minute.
Well, I think you and it's interesting when you reflect on a career, especially
Mm.
some of the longer careers of old farts like us. You, I think you were in web and mobile at a time I had actually left it, and I was working on
Mm-hmm.
back-end application programming. I was working with day traders doing black boxes at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And when I came back into it was when I joined WWE, the wrestling
Right.
folks.
Yeah.
Some of the viewers here may know of them. They're
It's
not
wrestling.
unfamous.
It's
Yes,
not wrestling.
exactly.
It's wrestling. I'm
Um,
from the South. It's wrestling.
it's interesting because they're an entertainment firm, obviously.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of circus going on in the ring, but the back end is surprisingly corporate. It's very structured, very
Mm-hmm.
corporate. And at the time, what we were working on was what was known as a WAP stack. Remember Web
Mm-hmm.
Application
Yeah.
Protocol? And
Yep.
that was like the early delivery of mobile something from web down to a mobile device. So
Mm-hmm.
WWE had a WAP stack, and I think around the time I was there was around the time they were retiring it. And my first real mobile project was partnering with a company called Bottle Rocket to build the second screen mobile app, which was an in-lap experience for a tablet. And that was actually pretty exciting because it was the first time we had audiences engaging live with on-air entertainment. And you can think that one of the biggest issues was not the user experience, kind of where you were
Mm-hmm.
focused on like responsive and things like that. It was really just the bandwidth and the transactional volume
Yeah.
because W2B can push 400,000 people to an experience in 10 minutes. They're one of the few firms that's big enough to actually drive that kind of engagement. So
Mm-hmm.
this was back in 2010, 2011. So you can imagine with 2010 technology trying to deal with what we would still struggle with today was, it was a very interesting engineering challenge anyway.
Yeah, and so I think that's the fun part of the discussion. In similar, when you talk about bandwidth problems, like I came from 3G, right? If anyone remembers what 2.5G is, like Edge, right? So the Sidekick, when I worked on it, one of the first things that I recognized is we actually had our own object patching protocol. So we wrote this was before gRPC, this was before all of the JSON stuff and the protobufs and the cool stuff that Google came out with that kind of solved some of those lower sort of microcontroller level bandwidth problems. Is we wrote our own protocol to manage the patching of objects across, again, an entire 3G network, because you could come in and out of connections. This is a problem that in 2024 people are probably like, wait, you had to actually deal with that? Excuse me. Just because of how pervasive technology is these days. And this is awesome, by the way. I'm not speaking disparagingly toward it. Again, as I said, old man screams at cloud, but at the same time, it's a very cool thing to think that back then you had to think about your buffer sizes. You had to think about, this object is 21 kilobits, and we have to make sure that we can synchronize that properly when we're kind of going in and out of service. And maybe that's a problem in certain spaces, but I think that's largely solved today thanks to infrastructure, so we don't have to think about it anymore.
It's funny, you're sort of waxing rhapsodic about 3G and kind of back in the day stuff, but here I am actually currently in a rural site working from a homestead on a Starlink, which is obviously holding up very well, so modern technology at its finest.
Doing great.
But if I shut my Starlink off, I would be on 3G right now, because that is the cell phone antenna that's available in this area. They haven't upgraded it. So it's funny how you see these things come full circle where these are solved problems, but boy, I would have no experience at all if not for some of the work you did probably 10, 20 years ago, right. With some of those, solving some of those problems, right?
Right. So, and I think let's take all of that wonderful bedrock of history and fun, and let's talk about some of the problems that have actually been solved and what modern web application frameworks. Like, this episode is about that. We want to talk about modern web application frameworks and how they solve it. And I want to do a brief aside here, because when I started, we were only on this one device. Andy Rubin was briefly the CEO of Danger, by the way, for any history buffs out there. He left to go start Android, which was the up and comer alongside, obviously, the iPhone. So I remember getting my first iPhone. Yeah, just some guy. I remember getting my first iPhone. I was working at Danger, and they were giving me hell about it. But I got the iPhone because I was just so fascinated. The multi-touch driver was something that I had experimented with in college with Keith Edwards and Melody Jackson Moore and other people that I did my master's degree with. This was, I think, NYU produced one of the first multi-touch drivers that we could play with in academia. Again, everything exists in academia like 7 years before we get it out here. But anyway, but the cool thing was that when I left Danger, that's when Titanium came along, right? If you remember Titanium. And excuse me, Ionic, what was the precursor to Ionic? What was it called? Cordova.
Apache Cordova, right.
Cordova. I actually built a master's degree project in Cordova because I wanted it to run on my iPad and my iPhone. It was a complete and utter waste of my time. It's so
I
buggy.
do not have fond memories of Cordova.
No fond memories of Cordova. But briefly, we go from Cordova, which splits off into Ionic, which is a different world, and then we have Titanium, which is the JavaScript-focused ones. Like, we've tried this 100 times. Xamarin, which is C#. What are you doing? Whatever.
Yeah.
Like, I worked on Silverlight, by the way. When I was at Microsoft, I worked on
fish
Silverlight.
Out of water.
So you're
Briefly
welcome. You're
replaced Flash, but not
you're
successfully.
using some of the stuff that I worked on. You're welcome, world. We went into Titanium, which was the first JavaScript. I remember getting the first Titanium SDK and be like, "What is this?" Because I was used to that hardcore in the weeds writing Java code, and then we moved on, and I kind of ducked out of mobile development for X number of years, and then when I started 7Factor, that's when React Native had just become the bee's knees. And when you and I met each other, you were like, "Hey, you really need to check out this React Native thing." And I'm like, "Whatever, dude. It's just JavaScript. I don't want to touch it. It makes me sick." And you're like, "No, seriously, check out this thing." And now we have Flutter and a few other ones. So talk to me a little bit about your survey. Give me Chad's survey of modern tools and what you think about them, and let's launch off from there.
Well, I have two thoughts that kind of come to mind. First of all, I think it's sometimes fun to think about what we no longer do. When was the last time anybody did serious cross-browser testing? It's not that we don't,
Yeah.
but in responsive web apps, we more or less expect that just about any browser out there will run our code. And if you think
Yeah.
about it, browsers have come a long way. That has helped a lot. And Safari is WebKit based now, and pretty much any site will run on any browser. But that was not always the case. In fact, it was not the case. It was definitively something that would definitely break. I remember we would have notices. Hey, we notice you're using Safari, and sorry, we don't support that. Please download Chrome. When was the last time you saw that on the website? Right? Don't have to do
Right.
that now. And mobile apps are kind of moving the same direction. It used to be when I was at Paltalk, we would have a team of 3 or 4 developers for each platform, 3
Mm-hmm.
on Android, 3 on iOS, 2 QA, and then 1 architect. That was me, plus product manager. So you're talking a really big team approach, a really expensive approach for most
Mm-hmm.
companies just to build a basic app. And that was because the platforms were remarkably different, and things
Mm-hmm.
like Cordova were not good enough.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what's interesting with React Native is not so much that you develop in JavaScript or TypeScript now, that we've all migrated to, it's the tooling, it's
Yeah.
your habits, your mechanisms, the way you structure projects, the developer experience is what's different. So it's not so much about sharing the code between your backend and your front end. We actually don't often do that because the code tends to be domain specific. If you've got business logic checking a record that you're submitting, you might put some of that in the front end to help the
Right.
user with a better experience, but it's going to happen in the back end anyway. But you
Right.
don't have a button click handler usually in a front end mobile app that gets copied into back end code, right? Who does that? What we do a lot of, though, is having our tooling, our linters, our
Mm-hmm.
unit testing and integration testing frameworks, our reporting tools and code quality checkers, and all of those things are the same in both environments, and the language itself. Just having good knowledge of TypeScript is a very portable skill, front end to back end. So I feel like it's made it much more accessible to more people, where we're seeing projects where I think mobile resisted the concept of full stack that web kind of always had for many years in smaller projects. And I think mobile is now starting to have that you can actually be a full
Yeah.
stack and be effective in mobile.
And then there was that brief period where things like Meteor existed.
Well, and we
Uh,
still have experiments like that. And I welcome those. Meteor, TRPC now. I don't know if you've seen that
mm-hmm.
project, but it's a
Yep.
way of merging front and back end, and sharing the types and models and transports between the two. And I love that project. I don't think it really scales well to big enterprise class apps, but I think for smaller proofs of concept and
Mm-hmm.
MVPs, it's great. And I think those tools are still really important to have because, look, we need tools. And if you look in a carpenter's toolbox, you're going to find hammers, which get used all day long, every
Mm-hmm.
day, and scribes that sometimes get used once a week. And I think we need both. So
Yeah.
I don't think it's bad to have those. But what React Native really changed was the bridging of the native code to the front end code, which
Right.
most people don't do. Let's face it. How many developers write truly platform native code every day? Not as many. And that's good. That's what we achieved. That was the whole point.
Yeah.
But you can do it easily, and the few people that need it, it's there for them. So it's very accessible, and I think that was really a big win.
Yeah, I think I liken this to the same as our transition from C++ into virtual machines like
Mm-hmm.
Java virtual machines and the .NET CLR and the Golang VM. Like as you sort of move up the chain of higher order languages, higher order abstractions. Again, programming language nerd, right? As you move up the chain with different grammars and higher level abstractions, that just tends to transpile down into something that's lower level.
Right.
We're not going to get
Right.
rid of the lower level stuff without reinventing silicon, which is happening. There's a lot of really cool stuff that has happened in the past, almost less than 5 years with silicon and how it can react to and manage IL pipelines, et cetera, and how you're running, machine learning code natively. You're doing all kinds of really cool
Oh
stuff.
yeah.
And that's great. And I think that mobile has sort of taken that direction too. And I think every technology stack is going to take that direction in the long term, where they're all going to be reduced to an exercise in executing against some application programming interface API, right? And that was great for, and I love what you said. That's great for mobile, because if I don't need to worry about the low level, and I was having this conversation with one of our customers when we were talking about Flutter versus React Native, and they went with Flutter, and that's fine, whatever, we don't care. But this idea of, do you actually need to interact with the hardware? Well, React Native's got you covered there. If you do, you can write these plugins, and Flutter as well. You can write these plugins if you need to, but the vast majority of humans that are writing software do not need to worry about any sort of lower level interaction, which will eventually, you'll get that, right? One day there'll be an AI toolkit for React Native if there isn't already.
So, not to overtalk this, but that kind of raised three things in my head. One, to your point about silicon, think about what we're doing with GPUs these days, and how much of what we do with GPUs is not graphic processing from a graphic processing unit, right? We're using it for all kinds of mathematical calculations and supporting AI and all these innovations which wouldn't have happened without GPUs. And that sort of enablement is happening in web and mobile. And think about languages. So you're bringing up like a lot of language elements, but let's look at a kind of a corollary. I would argue, and I don't think you'd shake your head at this, that one of the most fundamental changes that's happened in our industry in tooling in the past 5 to 10 years is Docker. And if you think about that, that's not a language, that's a technique slash methodology slash whatever you might want to call it in there. You could kind of apply 5 adjectives to it, but it has changed the methodology around how we deploy code, but also how we test it, how we manage it, and all the way back to how we develop it. And that's not a language, that's a technology. And that is happening, I think, in mobile as well, that React Native, you should think of it not as writing in JavaScript, not as a language play, but as a tooling play. It's a technology and a technique. And in that, when you look at how we build the code, think about this. Okay, so React Native made it very smooth and painless and seamless to write both native and business logic together, right? You get your native code if you want it, and your business logic is something easy like TypeScript. But most people don't do that. The important thing isn't that most people do that. Most people didn't need that. But the library author that builds a good drop-down control can do that. The author that builds a nice, smooth animation technique to navigate between screens has that capability available to them. And they are the geniuses in the room that we all stand on the shoulders of those giants, right? So when we write code, we're much more likely to be able to integrate good things written by other really, really bright people. And that means I can now do something in an hour that used to take me a week because it's out there and available, and it's nice and smooth and well done because that technology made it possible.
Yep. I mean, you just described our entire industry in one eloquent monologue. And I take a trip with me a little bit here, too, because if you remember back in the days, like the promises of Java, right? It ran on a toaster. That's legitimately true. What was the promises of Java, right? Write once, run anywhere. Okay. And there was a push
whether you want
inside,
it to or not.
yeah, whether you want it to or not, right? And there was a push in the industry for a long time. And I think the idea behind what Sun was trying to do was not to own a market. At least I don't think that's what they were after. They open sourced it. They were looking to build and create a community similar to the Linux community, like the Linux kernel and how that's developed, that everyone can now have access to a singular programming language with a singular baseline set of APIs and a singular runtime that can run anywhere, right? And then competition came along, thanks capitalism, which again, I am completely fine with this. I am obviously a capitalist, or I wouldn't run my own company. And what happened there is now you see other implementations of the same idea come out. So Java, I'm probably wrong here, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say that Java is likely the first effective implementation of a write once, run anywhere approach, right?
Sure. I would agree.
I'm sure if you go back into the annals of GCC and the old school C community, someone out there has tried to do this before, and it just really didn't cut it for whatever reason. Java was the first attempt at that, and then you saw that evolve into this concept of more abstractions. You mentioned Docker. To me, Docker is the ultimate abstraction, right? It's like Inception, container and container and container, because these days everything runs in containers. Your Amazon EC2 instance, guess what? It's not metal. Right, unless you buy a metal box, it's a Zen virtual machine or whatever they're basing their stuff on these days, and then you're running Docker on top of that. So you're putting containers inside containers inside containers, and that is a good thing though, because to your point, the problem Docker solved is the server fragmentation issue, where I have a machine and it drifts for some reason. Containers are reusable. You can, spin it down and spin it back up. It looks exactly like the way when you built the layer cake. It's a brilliant piece of technology.
They're hard to hack.
It's very difficult to hack because the file systems are immutable. Right. Like it's a really, really revolutionary technology. I will go on record saying it's probably the most important technology that we have started using as a community in many, many years. And yes, I know VirtualBox. I know there's all kinds of other stuff that's out there, right? You mentioned standing on the shoulders of giants and capitalism and competition. Docker was the first people to get there and to get into the enterprise brain and to say, hey, look at how easy this is. And that in turn resulted in this beautiful abstraction that we now have, right?
Right.
Mobile is you're hitting on the same point. Mobile is the same idea. Now we've kind of leveled up. We have this abstraction. We have a couple of competitors in the market. We've got React Native and Facebook behind that. And then we've got Google and Flutter behind that. Xamarin's probably still somewhere over in the corner eating glue. Like
still there's lots exists, but
it's still
dwindling.
There, right? Hate me in the comments. I don't care. But to me, the two big players again are Flutter, which is a much less player, and then React Native. And I love what you said, because now I can write unit test and component test. I can build componentry around my business logic to ensure it's well architected. Whereas back in the day, you could do this, but it's a lot more difficult. And if you have to do one in a Swift code base, which God help you if you like writing Swift, there's something weird in your brain. And then you've got Java, which is, again, everybody's language. It's like, everybody knows Java. Whether you want to or not, you have to know it. And then you can dig into Kotlin and some other variants there. But the point being that the next level frameworks have really given us more of a handle on quality, which is a problem that I struggle with back in the day, because sometimes the only way to figure out if your stuff runs is to transpile it and put it on the platform and test it. And if you brick it, well, I hope you have a JTAG cable.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things that outsiders from our industry don't always realize or have trouble grasping is, like, go back to Docker, right? How much of what that was tooling, not language. When you think about development, the first thing a lot of people think about is language. Even we do that, right? Yeah. But it is so not that anymore. And that's one of the biggest changes. When I started in this industry, I'm not tooting my own horn here, but I once sat down and counted. I have learned to a mastery level that I've forgotten at this point, but 26 languages in my career. Yeah. But that's not a brag. That is just an indicator of how much our industry evolves over the years. Languages are ephemeral. We don't hold on to them. And it's easy to not realize how little crystal balling happens in our industry, how much of what progress comes out in our industry happened by either happenstance or luck or chance or anything else, right? So lately I've been engaging a lot more in Reddit because, I've kind of gotten disinterested in Twitter with everything, judge however you want, but I can't bring myself to go through all the hate comments and everything. I just don't have the time. So I've been engaging more in Reddit to try to still discover new frameworks and things that people post about. And you always run into people coming into our industry. What language should I learn? That's the first question we ask. And the problem is that it's really hard to answer the question of what will you be using in 10 years, because we don't even really reflect on that ourselves. There's a ton of experimentation, and that is really part of the process. There's a lot of stuff that, my mother, who is not Italian, does the old Italian trick when she cooks spaghetti. Have you heard of this one where you throw the spaghetti against the wall? When a piece of spaghetti sticks, it's done, ready. Because that's when the starch is coming out. But I love that analogy for throwing things against the wall and seeing what sticks, because that's sort of like what our industry does. We throw a lot of stuff out there and we kind of see what wins. I don't think anybody thought React would be as dominant as it is now, even if
Right.
Facebook hoped it would be. They had a hope and a dream that it would, but at the time, Angular was the monster dominant player.
Mm-hmm.
And they had all kinds of things for enterprise apps and lots of stuff like that that really it was sort of hard to see back around Angular 1.4, 1.5 days that React would succeed.
Right.
But it did because it's simple, lightweight, fast, small, and really easy to approach. I can
Mm-hmm.
do things in it in an hour that used to take me, a full day in Angular. And I think that's sort of the process that we go through where it's not about the language, it's really about the process. And that's why the tooling matters almost more than the language that you use it with.
Right, I agree, and that's where React Native, I think, has played its cards right, in that
Right.
they have the best tool, like they're the best chainsaw
It
in the
is.
market right
It,
now.
it, it's a framework. It's a set of tools. It is not a language. And so you don't
Right.
learn a language. In fact, it's almost a meta language on top of it, where we find as developers now that we have to learn a language and then we have to learn a framework, right? We have to learn a stack of two separate things rather than just one thing to be effective. And that's not
Right.
true in every area. There's still plenty of people doing pretty groundbreaking work in Python and
Mm-hmm.
using just low level libraries there and just kind of writing the code as is. But I think in a lot of areas, even in Python, if you're using it for web dev, you're still seeing a lot of frameworks, happening there. So
Right, and I think to your point, you got to learn how to use the chainsaw, the hammer, the
yep.
screwdriver, the ratchet, and I've gone on record with this a lot, and I'll even talk to some clients that tell me, yeah, well, at least these days I've seen a lot less. Maybe in the past 5 or 6 years, I feel like all of the engineering leaders I've spoken to have the same idea as we do, which is
Hmm.
you just figure it out. It's just a language, right? It's
Right.
just semantics. But then you kind of go back a little bit, and I'm going to hate here just a tiny bit on some of you that believe that you need to standardize on a single stack, or that you need to pick like one line. You really don't. I mean, you do if your talent pool is limited, and you need to ensure that the folks that are working on your projects are able to grow and become experts in something. But then you again talk about front and back end split and full stack, and I mean I have articles on my opinions on that. So I think the idea is that a language is a language is a language. It's a tool. It's just a way of expressing business logic that translates into IL that runs on some virtual machine somewhere. And similarly, React Native and Flutter and all of these mobile toolings have taken that approach and brought that into the mobile world, to where now I have to think a lot less about, well, what's the right asset to call here so it has the correct resolution for an iPhone 4 or whatever I'm
Right.
going after. It solves those hard problems for you, so that you don't have to. And any good API, any good abstraction across a developer's experience, that's exactly what it's going to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. And I think that one thing that we still haven't solved for yet, and maybe we never will, because maybe
Mm.
it's more of a condition than a problem to solve, is that we still need a lot of input. Like, it's easy to think
Mm-hmm.
that I'm a developer, I can sit down and bang out an app in a hot weekend, and I've done that before. They aren't particularly any good. But it can be done. But the reason they're not good is that it still takes the village. You still need
Mm-hmm.
the product managers and the QA
Yep.
folks and everybody that was always involved in these before are still very relevant today, because at the end of the day, if you build an app that users don't want to use or doesn't actually solve a problem that they have, it's still garbage. And it was 20 years ago and it still is today.
Yep.
But the way we communicate about those things has changed, because since these technologies evolve so quickly, we need to be very agile about how we integrate this new tech into our life cycle, that
Right.
in a way that I think enterprises still struggle with. That methodology of taking, 2 to 4 week sprints and taking 3 months to roll out a feature is just not fast enough, which is
Right.
sort of, react, move fast and break things kind of mode. But I think agile SDLCs have helped a lot. Kanban flows and things like that have given us the opportunity to do that. But look at React and React Native. I would say that as a developer building a mobile app today, yes, I develop in TypeScript and I develop in React Native, but I really think of myself not as developing in React. I
Mm-hmm.
mostly spend my day working with tools like MobX for my state store management. And,
Mm-hmm.
if you're familiar with TanStack, they've got a number of tools in there, the most important of which in my space is TanStack Query. And I spend a lot of my time wiring data. And TanStack Query has become almost this meta framework inside React,
Mm-hmm.
where I spend the bulk of my time moving data around using that tool to do it. And that was really groundbreaking. So now I've got
Mm-hmm.
three levels of sort of meta layers built on top of each other.
Yeah, for sure. So I think, oh my goodness, that was such a great conversation. We'll take a quick brief here because I was about to say something and then you said something else that got me cross-wired, and I was going to say the same thing.
Get you
So
distracted?
yeah, you distracted me with TANS. I was going to mention how it reminds me of GraphQL because it kind of does a
Oh,
little bit.
well, I can fill that airspace easily. GraphQL is a great example of something that I would call a fad. Now, I do not want to imply that GraphQL is dead. It is not. It is still a very
Mm,
valuable tool and technology. But one of the other things our industry has, in addition to all this great innovation, is we have a lot of fads. We have a lot of things
mm-hmm.
that get great blog posts and a lot of, high visibility people promoting, and then you read about it in the in-flight magazine, and your CTO lands from the flight at the conference and says, "Why don't we use GraphQL in our app?" But GraphQL is a great example of something that, in my opinion, was a fad. It's very overused, in my opinion. And the reason
Mm-hmm.
I believe that is that it was invented to solve a specific problem that Facebook had. And that problem is Facebook has little to no direct interaction with their developers. I'm not talking about their internal dev team. I'm talking about the third party. Facebook is not
Mm-hmm.
an app, it's a platform. It's a really fundamental difference. Most things think they're platforms and want to be platforms, but aren't. Most things are
Yeah.
apps at the end of the day. They want
Right.
they're when they put the big boy pants on, they want to be a platform, but they're an app today because they don't have 37,000 developers around the world integrating with them. That's what makes it a platform. Facebook is a platform. And they don't have Monday morning conversations and stand ups with 37,000 developers around the world
Right.
about what new API change they're going to have and how they're going to alter their data model to add some fields and refactor their data structures. So, how do they deal with that? They need a self help mechanism. They can't deal with the constant versioning and data structure changes that would break everybody's apps. They don't want to break those. So, GraphQL is a perfect answer for that. That's also a really good answer, even in enterprise like Microsoft, heavily
Mm-hmm.
relies on GraphQL when you're dealing with like Active Directory integrations. I mean, that's already a tree
Mm-hmm.
to begin with. So you need GraphQL to solve problems like that where developers need to self-help. But if
Right.
your tree of developers is two people sitting in a room working Monday to Friday, taking specs on what your API contains from one other person on the backend team who's maybe a full stack and contributing to both projects, you probably don't need GraphQL. And it introduces complexities a lot of companies aren't ready for that often are not written about in the blog posts. A lot of those blog posts don't walk through all the cons, the extra response time and latency added to it, the extra infrastructure costs to build and host it. Anybody that's ever written a VTL in AWS AppSync is probably nodding their heads right now. It
Mm.
is not a 5-second addition to your stack. It takes a lot of extra time to work with. And so I think right now we're seeing that where I heard a lot about it, 5, 6 years ago. Why aren't we using that? We should use it everywhere. I'm not hearing that anymore.
Yeah, it's similar to the meme where you have the little container on a giant flatbed truck that said I installed my blog on
Absolutely.
Kubernetes.
Kubernetes. Yep. I
Kubernetes
love
is
that one.
another one of those, and we won't go into that. That's another one of those technologies that I love. It's near and dear to my heart. It does a lot of really great things, but you probably don't need it. Like
Right.
90% of the people on the planet are, again, developing an application that has business value, and your goal is to get the thing out, not worry about this complex infrastructure
Yeah.
problem.
If you aren't
So
Uber, you probably don't need it.
exactly. So last thing let's touch on, and I wanna actually poke the bear a little bit here. Let's
Okay.
talk about PWAs.
Okay.
Are PWAs
Oh,
trash?
yes.
Because I think they're trash. Sorry.
Well,
Sorry, not sorry.
no, I don't disagree with one caveat, though. This is one of those examples of how quickly web tech can change. It
Mm-hmm.
used to be 10, 15, 20 years ago that we would actually pay attention to when browsers would support some new CSS or JavaScript feature.
Mm-hmm.
We mostly don't do that anymore. Can I use.com is still very valuable and plenty of people pay attention to it, but mostly it's library authors. Can I
Mm-hmm.
take advantage of some new CSS feature for this dropdown I'm building?
Right.
Um, I think the same thing has happened here, though, with PWAs, is that PWAs are all about, does the browser support this function that a native app would have been required before to get? Geolocation. Browsers have
Yep.
come a long way. Not perfection, hard to do in the background, but come a long way, right? Push notifications, not so much. They
Right.
exist, they're there, but they're not the same as doing true local and remote notifications in iOS, for instance. They just aren't the same. They
Mm-hmm.
aren't on par. So I think, though, that although I agree with you, I build a lot of mobile apps. So I maybe I have to. We all have to admit our own bias because we bring biases to the table. But bias comes from two things. It comes from opinion, but it also comes from experience. And
Yes.
my experience has been with PWAs has generally been disappointment. That they generally don't. You always find some glass ceiling where something you want to do you can't do, and now you're stuck, right? But because web tech changes so fast, I will add this one caveat that I think people should at least consider them
Mm-hmm.
and rule them out. Generally, rule them out. But at least every single project you start, take a look, see what's changed, and just make sure it won't work for you. The App Store approval process is still very long. We've got a client right
Yes.
now that has been dragged through the muck by Apple for like 3 weeks now, really struggling to get their app in, complying with all the policies, jumping through the hoops. PWAs do an end run around that. It's at
Yep.
least worth taking a look at.
Yeah. I've found PWAs are useful when you have a very specific need, and I have yet to
Yeah,
find that need,
a
unfortunately.
small one.
So
Probably a
for
small one.
me, it's better to just write a React app. Like if you know you're going to go to app stores and you're going to use some specific features that are on the hardware, you might as well just go ahead and bite the bullet and go with React Native. The barrier to entry
Yeah,
is so low, it makes sense to just execute. But if you know that you want to launch an idea and get feedback on it and just get it out there in the ether without incurring the cost of a mobile application developer, because a lot of people, again, will put mobile application developer trademark on their resume and be 10 to 15% more expensive just because they have that on their resume, right? Supply and demand.
right.
If you want, go ahead and throw it out in something like React or Angular or Vue or whatever your favorite flavor is with the appropriate media queries and kind of simulate PWA on your own instead of going
Yeah.
all in on a framework that does this mobile app development plus PWA. I'm looking at you, Flutter. I think React Native does that too, but I don't know. Instead of going all in on something proprietary that might bite you later, and the supply of developers on the market are difficult to find, and so it will be more expensive, just write it in JavaScript, get it out there, see if it works, and then once you are making some money, do your pivot and make your decision then.
Yeah. I have a litmus test for you and for any listeners here. I think if you are considering building a mobile app, consider PWAs, but set your expectation that you will probably not find them meeting your needs. However,
Mm-hmm.
if you have a web app, and particularly if you've made it mobile responsive and you'd like to add some more mobile native features to that existing web app,
That makes
PWAs
sense.
almost certainly are worth considering because they're usually a lightweight addition. You usually don't have to
Mm-hmm.
do too much to get access to those features, and that
Yeah.
can be pretty light lift. Now, I just want to set an expiration date on my litmus test, though, that this is not like a 5-year recommendation. I would say this is probably relevant for the next 6 to 9 months
Yeah.
because right now, React Native, as we know, is in this process of adding web. And it's sort of, I wouldn't say infancy, but early days of
Mm-hmm.
being able to support that, where there's still a bunch of things that are kind of rough edges and don't really work, and it's a little manual process, and you have to sort some things out. But it is coming very soon to a platform near you, and I think what will happen is we will see a shift over the next 2 years where more and more apps will get built that way. And the people that are like the bleeding edge and groundbreaking there will help sort some of those things out, and it will become more mature. So in the next couple of years, we may find ourselves building a lot more in React Native and targeting all three platforms with it.
I think that's fair. That would be great to have that work correctly. But again,
Yeah.
most of the time it doesn't. So anyway, thanks, Chad. It's great always to hang out and chat with you. Hopefully you, the listener / watcher, got some quality entertainment and also some great content from this. Comment below what you like. React Native, Flutter, whatever, right? I don't really care. We've done them all and we like them all. But thanks for everybody's time. And Chad, we'll talk to you soon.
My pleasure. Have a great day, everyone.
See ya.